Inflation is the quietest destroyer in human history. It doesn't march with armies, it doesn't storm palaces, it doesn't raise flags or fire guns. Inflation kills slowly, silently, mathematically. Empires fall not because their enemies were strong, but because their currency became weak. And once you learn the real history of inflation, not what schools teach, not what governments say, but what actually happened, you understand a terrifying truth. The world today is repeating the exact same patterns that destroyed the greatest civilizations before us. This is the hidden history of inflation, a history governments want you to forget. Because if people understood how inflation actually works, they would never trust their leaders again. Chapter 1. Rome, the first hyperinflation. The Roman Empire did not fall in a single day. It decayed from within, one coin at a time. The denarius, Rome's iconic silver coin, began as 95% silver. But Rome had a problem. Its government grew faster than its income. Armies expanded, borders stretched, wars drained the treasury, so emperors used the oldest trick known to mankind. They debased the currency. They melted pure silver coins, added copper, minted new coins, and pretended nothing had changed. Under Emperor Nero, purity dropped from 95% to 90%, then 85%, then 60%. And by the 3rd century, Rome's silver coins had almost no silver at all. Inflation exploded. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 coin cost hundreds, then thousands. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Merchants stopped accepting currency. Farmers refused to sell food for worthless money. Rome's economy collapsed before its borders did. By the time barbarians arrived, the empire was already financially dead. Inflation didn't just weaken Rome, inflation destroyed Rome. Chapter 2. Weimar Germany. When money became firewood, history's most famous inflation crisis began in 1921. Not because Germany lacked money, but because Germany created too much of it. After World War I, Germany owed enormous reparations. The government could not pay. Raising taxes was political suicide. Cutting spending was impossible. So they followed Rome's example. They printed money. At first it seemed harmless. Prices rose slowly. Exports increased. People felt richer. But inflation is a beast that cannot be controlled. By 1922, it accelerated. By 1923, it exploded. Workers were paid 3 times a day, morning, noon, evening, because money lost value every hour. Children played with stacks of banknotes. Women burned money in stoves because it was cheaper than firewood. In 1914, $1 was worth 4 German marks. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4,910,000 marks. This was not an economic crisis. It was a civilizational breakdown. People lost their savings. Families starved. Crime surged. The middle class was wiped out. And from the ashes of hyperinflation rose a political extremist who promised stability, Adolf Hitler. Inflation didn't just destroy money. It destroyed a society and paved the way for one of history's darkest chapters. Chapter 3. Zimbabwe. When trillions become nothing. In the 2000s, Zimbabwe printed money to cover government spending. At first, it seemed like a miracle. More money meant more growth. Politicians celebrated themselves. But printing money does not create wealth. It creates the illusion of wealth. By 2008, Zimbabwe reached inflation rates so absurd they hardly seem real. 89.7 sextillion% per year. That's 89,700,000,000,000,000,000%. Zimbabwe printed $100 trillion banknotes, the highest denomination ever issued. And still, people starved. The lesson was identical to Rome and Weimar Germany. When a government creates money without limits, inflation becomes the wrecking ball of nations. Chapter 4. Venezuela. The modern warning. Venezuela should have been one of the richest nations on earth. It had enormous oil reserves, the largest in the world. But corruption, mismanagement, and endless money printing turned it into an economic disaster. The government printed currency to fund social programs, subsidies, and political loyalty. When inflation rose, they printed more. When prices exploded, they printed even more. By 2018, inflation hit 1,000%. People carried cash in backpacks. Families fled the country. Food became scarce. Salaries became worthless overnight. Inflation didn't just break the economy, it broke the social structure. Chapter 5: The United States, the Unspoken Crisis. Now we arrive at the most important part of the story. Most Americans believe hyperinflation could never happen here. They said the same thing in Rome, Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. But the United States has quietly followed the same early pattern. Since 1971, when the dollar left the gold standard, the U.S. money supply has exploded. M2 money, total dollars in the economy, increased 5x between 1970 and 2000, 2x more by 2020, and then the Federal Reserve printed 40% of all dollars in existence in just 2 years during the pandemic. This is the largest monetary experiment in human history. And here's the disturbing truth. Inflation today is not temporary, it's structural. It's built into the system. Why? Because the U.S. government is $34+ trillion in debt. It has no intention of paying it back. It can't raise taxes enough. It can't cut spending enough. So the only solution is the same solution every collapsing empire used: print more money and inflate the debt away. This is the beginning of a long, slow, inevitable decline. Not sudden like Weimar, not explosive like Zimbabwe, but grinding like Rome. Chapter 6: The Secret Reason Governments Love Inflation. Inflation feels like an accident, a mistake, a failure of policy. But inflation is intentional. It benefits governments and the wealthy. Here's how. 1. Inflation silently reduces the value of government debt. If you owe $30 trillion, weakening the dollar is your best strategy. 2. Inflation pushes citizens into higher tax brackets. The government collects more without raising taxes. 3. Inflation forces people to borrow more. Debt is profitable for banks. 4. Inflation transfers wealth from savers to asset owners. The rich get richer. Everyone else gets poor. Inflation is not a bug. It is a design. Inflation is not a modern invention. It is the oldest political tool in the world, and the most effective one. It lets governments steal wealth without passing a single law, without raising a single tax, and without firing a single shot. To understand why inflation keeps returning century after century, you must see the full pattern, the cycle that repeats every time money becomes too easy to create. This is the continuation of the hidden history governments desperately want you to forget. Chapter 7: The Pattern of Every Inflationary Collapse. Whether it's Rome in the 3rd century, Germany in 1923, or Venezuela in 2018, every inflationary crisis follows the exact same 6-stage pattern. Not similar, identical. The details change. The currency changes. The leaders change. But the pattern never changes. Stage 1: Government overspending. It always begins with political ambition. Leaders make promises they cannot afford. Wars, social programs, infrastructure, subsidies, pensions. To win elections or maintain power, governments must spend more than they collect. Deficits become permanent. Stage 2: Debt becomes unpayable. The debt grows faster than the economy. Politicians refuse to raise taxes. Voters hate it. They refuse to cut spending. Interest groups block it. Debt becomes the political heroin of the state. Stage 3: Printing money becomes the temporary solution. To avoid hard decisions, leaders choose the easiest path. Create new money, quietly, slowly. At first, no one notices. Prices rise, but incomes rise too. It looks harmless, even helpful. This phase fools everyone. Stage 4: Currency confidence breaks. People suddenly realize money is losing value faster than they can earn it. They stop saving. They spend quickly. They demand higher wages. Foreign investors flee. Merchants raise prices weekly, then daily. Once confidence breaks, restoring it is almost impossible. Stage 5: The inflation spiral. To keep up with rising prices, governments print more money. And printing more money makes prices rise even faster. This is the deadly loop. Rome hit it. Weimar Germany hit it. Zimbabwe hit it. Venezuela hit it. Once the spiral begins, collapse is inevitable. Stage 6, the final breakdown. The currency dies. Savings evaporate. Crime surges. Political extremism rises. The middle class disappears. People lose trust in institutions. And a new political order emerges, almost always authoritarian. Inflation doesn't just destroy money. Inflation destroys stability, trust, and democracy itself. Chapter 8. The United States is in the early stages. Many Americans laugh at the idea of hyperinflation. They imagine wheelbarrows of cash and trillion-dollar bills. They think it could never happen here. But hyperinflation is not an event. It is a process. And the United States has already crossed the first 4 stages, overspending $34 trillion in debt and rising by $1 trillion every 100 days. Unpayable debt. The government spends more on interest than on the military. Printing money. Over 40% of all dollars in existence were printed after 2020. Loss of confidence. People don't trust the dollar's long-term value. Foreign nations are diversifying into gold. U.S. allies are exploring alternative payment systems. The fuse has been lit. No one knows how fast the explosion comes, but we know how the pattern ends, because it has ended the same way every time for 2,000 years. Chapter 9, the most dangerous part. When inflation becomes political, inflation becomes catastrophic when politicians lie about it, the media downplays it, central banks pretend to control it, people choose sides instead of solutions. This is exactly what happened in Weimar Germany. The government insisted inflation was temporary. Newspapers called critics alarmists. Economists promised stability. By the time people realized the truth, it was too late. Modern governments use the same script. We have everything under control. Inflation is transitory. We are managing the situation. These statements were lies in every inflation cycle before, and they are lies now. Because inflation is not an economic problem. It is a political one. And political problems do not get solved. They get delayed until they explode. Chapter 10. Why inflation always hits the poor. First, inflation is not fair. It is not neutral. It does not hit everyone equally. In fact, inflation is the most regressive force in modern society. The poor pay first. The middle class pays second. The wealthy profit. How? The poor hold cash. Cash loses value the fastest. The middle class holds salaries. Wages rise slower than prices. The wealthy hold assets. Stocks, land, and real estate rise with inflation. Inflation is not a tax. Inflation is a wealth transfer from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. Every time it happens, the pattern is identical. Rome's peasants starved. Weimar's middle class evaporated. Venezuela's poor fled the country. Zimbabwe's workers became refugees. Inflation is the invisible guillotine. Chapter 11. Why today's inflation is worse than any in history. Most people think modern inflation is mild, manageable, slow. They are wrong. Today's inflation is far more dangerous than Rome or Weimar Germany because 1. It is global. All major countries are printing money at the same time. 2. It is digitized. Money moves at the speed of the internet. Inflation can accelerate instantly. 3. It is political, not accidental. Governments need inflation to avoid default. 4. The world has more debt than any point in history. $315 trillion globally. This is mathematical suicide. 5. People have no savings cushion. Most families cannot survive 1 month without income. Inflation today is not the slow erosion of Rome's silver coins. It is a global financial wildfire. All it needs is a spark. Chapter 12. The lessons. People never learn. The saddest part of the hidden history of inflation is this: humanity refuses to learn from it. Rome repeated the mistakes of Greece. Weimar repeated the mistakes of Rome. Zimbabwe repeated the mistakes of Weimar. Venezuela repeated the mistakes of Zimbabwe. And now the modern world is repeating them all. Inflation is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is always created by the same decisions: overspending, political cowardice, endless money printing, refusing to cut budgets, refusing to face reality. And the result is always the same: collapse, chaos, extremism, and a new authoritarian order. The names change, the dates change, the flags change, but the pattern does not. Inflation is the oldest enemy of civilization, but it's also the one people notice last. Because inflation doesn't walk down the street with a weapon. Inflation walks into your life quietly, through higher grocery bills, through shrinking salaries, through rising rents, through disappearing savings. It destroys everything, not with violence, but with mathematics. Chapter 13, The Final Warning. If history teaches one thing, it's this: inflation is how empires die. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. It fell because its money became worthless. Weimar didn't fall because of war. It fell because the middle class lost everything. Venezuela didn't fall because of sanctions. It fell because the government printed money to survive. The United States isn't special. It isn't immune. It isn't protected by geography or technology. No empire in history has survived unlimited money creation, and none ever will. Inflation is the quiet executioner of nations, and the blade is already descending.